Okay. All right. Now we're getting to some of the subjects that I know you all love. Today we're going to be talking about critiques. And first, we're going to talk about the story of a critique. In general, when you're making a critique argument, what story are you trying to tell the judge? And I know this is where a lot of students' interest lies because this is where a lot of the types of arguments you make in real life are very similar to critiques. So in debate, they might appear a little bit different, or we might be talking about a different subject or a different way of thinking about it. But, at the age that you're at, you are beginning to see the world a little more clearly, and you're being able to figure out, why are people saying or doing the things that they're doing? Not just what are they doing, but why are they doing it? And as part of a critique, what you're going to be looking at is the affirmative plan and why it's being done. And you're going to be able to say, whether I agree or disagree with the plan itself as a general thing, I may disagree with some of the underlying parts of it, which to me might be a reason why we should not pass the plan or why we should do something different than the plan. So, as part of the story of the critique, um, obviously it's a negative argument. You're going to bring it up in the 1NC. But the thing that makes a critique different than the previous other arguments you've had is that a critique looks at the underlying values of a plan and talks about why they might be problematic. Now, if you don't know what underlying values means, that's okay. We're going to go over that today. Um, but critique also shows how those underlying values might affect the plan itself and might have other negative effects outside the plan. And a critique suggests an alternative to the plan, like a counter plan does, saying, instead of doing the plan, we should try doing this other thing. And I've included this very basic bad meme in here because once we get to a critique, you're starting to make big brain plays in debate, right? You're starting to think about not just the plan itself, but what are the consequences of thinking a particular way in debate or in your real life, and how does that affect you as a debater, and how does that affect the plan itself? So, whereas in the previous tiers in counterplan disads and in just using the negative case arguments, everything had been directly related to the plan. Now we're moving a little bit away from that, and we're saying, okay, the plan is a thing that exists, but what exists behind the plan? What justifies the plan being passed, or what does this plan say? What does it tell us about the world? So uh, we're going to make some galaxy brain plays here in the critique arguments. So, what are underlying values? Underlying values are basically just the reason why something is being done or the thinking behind it. So, anytime you do anything in your real life, you may not realize this, but there are some underlying values for why you do it, right? You might, like, let's say you find money on the street or something, and you're like, oh man, these $10 don't belong to me. What should I do? Should I try to find the person who dropped this money, or should I keep this money for myself? Your answer to that question depends on what your underlying values are, right? You might keep the money because there's something you want to buy, either for yourself or someone else, or you might think it's just too much of a hassle to try to find who dropped it, or you might want to do it for some good reason, right? You might want to give it to like your organization or to your food shelf at your school or something like that, and you might think, well, that's a better use of the $10 than whoever was going to have it anyway. um, or you might go try to find the person who dropped the money, give it to them, like it belongs to them, it's their money. Depending on what your underlying values are, like you might have like religious values or family values, or our society has values in it. I should have put a Joker meme in here. But those are all things that affect your personal values, right? And what you choose to do. So sometimes the underlying values can be said, like, let's say you go to your parents and you're like, oh, I found this money on the ground. They'll probably tell you directly, you should go find whoever's money that is and give it back to them, because they're likely to promote those types of values, right? Or those values can be unsaid, like when you're thinking to yourself, what should I do with this money? You probably don't think, oh well, in second grade we learned about people's rights and how it's important to treat people fairly, and if I drop my money, I would want someone to bring it to me. So right, it's not likely to be said in that much detail. It's just sort of in your brain already. So sometimes underlying values can be really obvious. Like if someone just straight up tells you, I am doing this thing because I believe X. Okay, well, they just told you what their underlying values are, right? But sometimes it requires some thinking and reflection to figure out what exactly the underlying values are that are happening here. And a really simple way of thinking about this is, I know you're probably familiar with the term problematic or with cancel culture, right? So when you think about something someone does, if someone says it's problematic or they're canceled for doing it, there's usually some sort of underlying value that they're talking about, right? And we'll get into some of those examples in a little bit. So we're going to talk about one example first of underlying values. Let's say your parents have a policy in your house that you can only spend a certain amount of time in a week using electronics, maybe like 5 hours, 10 hours, whatever, right? Is this a bad idea on face? Maybe, maybe not. Like we'd have to debate out what are the advantages and disadvantages, right? And that's more the traditional debate you've done in the past. But in a critique, we might take a step back from the policy itself and say, okay, are there reasons we might think that the thinking behind this plan or this policy are problematic? And here's some we might think of that from your perspective might seem a little bit problematic, right? You might think that you're old enough or mature enough to manage your own time. So when your parents tell you, you know, you have to manage your time in this particular way, that's not very good for your growth, right? Or for your ability to be mature and to grow and decide how to manage your own time. And you might be insulted by it, right? If your parents tell you something like, you know, when you get home from school, you get 1 hour on the computer or 1 hour on the iPad, whatever you have, and then you have to do 4 hours of homework, and then we have dinner, and then you go to bed, right? If they set your schedule for you like that, you might find that kind of insulting. You might think, you know, you're treating me like a little child. I don't need to be treated like this. I can figure out my own time and figure out how I want to manage my life that suits me, right? Or you might, if you think you should be allowed to have more choice and say in your own life, you might think this is a bad policy, right? So is this a bad idea on face to say, you know, kids should only have a certain amount of hours that they spend on electronics? I don't know, maybe, maybe not. It depends on how that works out in your real life. But there are certainly reasons why, if you're, you know, if the parents doing this maybe don't have the best reasoning for it, or they're treating, you know, their middle school student aged child like a really young child, maybe that's not such a good thing, right? Maybe not such a good thing for them or the parents. So as with underlying ideas, it kind of depends on how extreme it is, right? If it's super extreme and the parents are like managing every moment of the day and they have these really strict policies around this, maybe that's not a very good idea, maybe not a very good thing. But if it's more lax, just sort of like, you know, in general, you have this time set for yourself, but everything else you sort of manage on your own, that's probably not so bad, right? So it definitely depends on how extreme the underlying values are. Let's look at a second example, more real life example about government assistance. So the government does give assistance to people for things like, you know, food stamps, housing, transportation, stuff like that that you need for like your daily life. And I think in general, most people would say that's good, right? It's better to have that rather than not have that for people who qualify for it or sign up for it or feel like they need it, right? It's good for them to be able to buy food and get where they need to go and have housing. Totally a good thing, right? But there might be some values behind government assistance, definitely certain types of government assistance that justify other bad policies or make the government assistance just simply not work, right? So one thing we might think about is like the government will give people food stamps, but only for particular types of food. And what the government is saying when it's doing that is it's saying, I recognize that you need this food, that you need food, but I don't trust you to make the right decisions about what food is right for you, about what food you should be buying. So I'm going to step in and tell you that you can only buy particular things, and you don't have a choice about, you know, what different varieties you want or what works best for your life. So is it good to have that food? Yes. Is it bad that the government wants to tell people how to live their lives more than better than the people who would be spending money themselves, that's probably also a bad thing, right? Or welfare to work programs, right? If someone says, I need welfare, I need help, the government in some states will say, okay, we'll give you some money, but only if you get a job and work a certain amount of hours. So let's say you're getting welfare because you have a child and you're a single parent and you want to be able to take care of them without having to work a bunch so you can spend time with them and be able to, actually raise your kid well. Um, a welfare to work program is basically saying, okay, we understand there's some need, but also we don't want to seem lazy or like we're having a handout. So you have to also work. So if a person has to work and also do other things in their lives, it might kind of partially defeat the purpose of the welfare program, right? Because the other things you'd be getting, like time with your kid or time to do social interaction, whatever, you might lose if you have to also work in order to get the welfare. And then other things like housing vouchers that say, okay, we'll give you money for housing, but only if you live in a particular place or particular, rent range or something like that. So all of these say, yes, we will help you, which is a good thing. This person's asking for help, but the government knows better for you than you do. Now, you personally might think that's a good idea. Based on your family or your other values, you might say, yeah, that's actually a good idea. I think the government should do that. Some of you out there watching this video might say that's a bad idea. People know what's better for their lives and they should be able to make the choice on their own. So depending on what your underlying values are, you might actually think that these are good programs that work the way they're supposed to, or you might think that these are bad programs. Certainly most people who receive this type of help, from my understanding anyway, think that these sort of stipulations or these things attached to the help are kind of disrespectful and not very helpful, because they sort of say, to the person receiving them, you are not qualified to make decisions about your own life. We are going to make those decisions for you. And when you do the things we tell you to do, your life will be better, right? So I think you can see, especially based on the last example, how that's a little bit controlling and how that could be seen as disrespectful to the person who's actually receiving the help. Some underlying values in general that you've probably thought of and experienced in your own life. You could think of, this is just a short list because each slide only has so much space, right? But you've probably seen or witnessed, experienced racism in your own life, or sexism, homophobia, classism. I know you've experienced ageism based on your age, right? Someone making a decision about you or about what should happen to you based on your age, which doesn't really fit with what you want or what you expect in terms of being respected as a person. So these are different types of underlying values that in general we might see out in the world and might lead to particular, types of laws and things. For example, there used to be, up until the early 2000s, a law saying that, I think just in states, I don't think it was national, but just in states saying that marriage is between one man and one woman, right? And there's a lot of underlying values behind that law. There's like religious, cultural, local underlying values. And depending on where you're from and depending on what your underlying values are, you might see that as a sexist law or homophobic law or a law that has all other types of implications, right? And you would say, as a policy, that law has those features of being sexist or homophobic. Therefore, that law should not exist, right? And others of you might disagree with that based on what underlying values you have from your own life. So remember I talked about in the beginning, we're saying this is big brain plays that involve more than just the policy itself. They involve thinking about the underlying reasons for policies. Your underlying reasons for why policies should or shouldn't be passed has to do with your life, right? And where you've been and how you've grown up and the sort of institutions or cultural places that you're part of. That's going to be different for other people, and especially for your judges. So you need to be able to explain and articulate to your judges why a certain policy has problematic parts to it and why those problematic parts are in fact problematic. Because what seems obvious to you might not be obvious to other people. So that's what we're going to talk about. How do underlying values affect the actual plan passage? So if the underlying values are bad, it can negatively affect the plan, right? Just ask yourself, when a law is passed, how is that law carried out? Who does it? How do those underlying values affect those people who are carrying it out? So if a law is problematic and the people, actually putting the law together are also they have bad cultural values or bad underlying values, then that law is going to cause some problems, right? Even if a law is good, like let's say the Emancipation Proclamation, right? Objectively a good thing to not have slaves anymore. But the Emancipation Proclamation led to the Jim Crow era because the people who were implementing the law, who were taking care of the law and what happens after it, were still racist. So they still did racist things, right? And they said, well, we can't have slaves anymore, but we can at least do this other stuff that still keeps Black people and people of color largely under control and doing work for us, and we don't have to pay them, things like that. So in general, a law might be good, but if it's going to have these problematic outcomes or it's going to justify more problematic behavior, then it's probably not such a great thing, right? So in the end, as the negative, you're not just going to say that this thing is problematic. You're also going to say that when this thing is problematic, we have to have an alternative to it. We have to be able to say, instead of doing this, we should do something else. So what do? The negative can suggest a different way of thinking or acting that is against the problems underlying the affirmative. So if we say the affirmative is racist or whatever, then we have to be able to say, okay, here's a way to act that's not racist. And we want to also be able to say that the critique is going to solve the problems created by the plan. So if we're saying the plan will solve particular problems, the negative is probably going to come up and critique and say, well, actually, those problems are created by the underlying value of the plan. So therefore, if you solve the underlying value of the plan, you will actually solve the problems created by the plan itself. And I don't want to go too much into this, but basically your evidence will have more specific examples of this. And in a way, it's helpful to think about a critique like a counter plan, right? Because in a counter plan, you're saying, instead of doing the plan, we should do this other thing. In a critique, you're saying, instead of doing the underlying values of the plan, we should figure out these other underlying values, which would mean that we can't possibly do the plan if the plan has those underlying values. So this is a little abstract, and you may not be coming out of this video feeling like you fully understand critiques, but that's okay. Critiques are the most unique type of argument in debate. And when you first start thinking about them, it can take a little while before it really clicks in your brain what's going on here. So I suggest watching the other critique videos, listening, taking notes, talking to your coach, talking to your partner, and figuring out how it applies to your actual arguments in the debate and how it applies more generally in your life in general. So enjoy it, and I'll see you in the next video.